take myself off mute. Now's a good time to start, I suspect. So, good morning, everybody. Many thanks for joining us today, and welcome to Camwood's review of Microsoft Ignite 2021. My name is James Churchill. I'm Camwood's head of sales, and joining me today is Camwood's head of technology, Daniel Williams. And over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be looking to spend the time discussing all things Microsoft Ignite and the key announcements and takeaways from the event that was held at the end of last year. And as you can see here from the agenda, we'll start off very quickly just touching on what Microsoft Ignite is before diving into some of the key announcements. And for today, we'll be focusing on Microsoft's approach for modern management, security, and Microsoft Teams. We'll then spend some time talking about their new employee experience platform called Microsoft Viva, before finishing off with with Windows 11 and all the key announcements with regards to that. And at the end, we'll make sure there's enough time for any questions. So if you do have any questions at all, feel free to drop them into the comments box here or raise your hand at the end, and we'll make sure we'll get all your questions answered. So with that, I'll pass over to Daniel now, who will start off with what Microsoft Ignite is. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, James. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. So as James said, I think we'll just kick off with a quick round of what is Microsoft Ignite. I would have thought most people do sort of know what Ignite is and ultimately what it's for from a delivery perspective, certainly from a Microsoft conferencing perspective. So Ignite's more around the technical side of things whenever we talk about the Microsoft product stack. So they've got a number of different conferences throughout the year, some through Inspire, which is more sort of partner-led and really around sort of what's worked really, really well from a customer experience that year. Ignite's more around the tech specifically. So in very sort of similar fashion to Inspire, they do a lot of major product announcements through here, but sort of more importantly, because it's more about the technology and ultimately the people that are running and looking after the technology, you've got things like solution workshops, live Q&A with the actual developers and program managers within Microsoft. And certainly more recently, over the last couple of years, we've had more and more sort of training sessions, certification alignments and sessions around that to help technical staffing improve their Microsoft skill set as a whole. So sort of in summary, Ignite's probably my favorite conference to attend, and it's normally sort of a 2 or 3 day event. The last couple of years it's been virtual, but prior to that it was held in Las Vegas, if anyone was lucky enough to get over there before the pandemic. But they also started rolling out sort of regional conferences within Europe and across Latin America and APAC, etc. from that perspective. So it's a really, really interesting conference, and hopefully when we come out of the pandemic, maybe this year, fingers crossed, we'll be able to attend in person again. So onto the major announcements. Now there's far too many announcements to talk about and certainly to put onto one slide, but I've picked out the ones that are probably the most interesting for me from a Microsoft solution stack sort of development perspective, as well as some of the ones that are a little bit closer to myself and ultimately the Camwood organization as a whole. So I'll go sort of top left to right and then work our way through them. The first one is Microsoft Loop. So Microsoft Loop, if anyone hasn't sort of heard of it or seen it, it's currently in public preview and you can actually access it through Microsoft Teams at the moment if you wish, assuming you have the public preview enabled on Microsoft Teams as a whole. But Microsoft Loop, following sort of Microsoft's theme of collaboration through the workspace and workplace, it's ultimately a way to collaborate on not necessarily documents, but collaborate on specific things within a Teams channel. So a really good example is you may have a large team, you may be setting up a meeting and you may want to do an agenda. So through Loop, you're able to attach an agenda list into Microsoft Teams itself in a very similar manner to sort of collaborating on online documents within Microsoft Word and Excel. You can have everyone within that particular Teams channel access it and ultimately make amendments and appendments to what is that. Also on top of that, you can do things like typical sort of app registrations and everything else. So it was based off what was Fluid Apps, if anyone knows what that is previously, but it's just extending the collaboration capability within Microsoft Teams to make it a little bit more interesting. Context IQ is quite an interesting one. It's not a new concept. So Context IQ is effectively things like auto-filling words whenever you're typing out an email, automatically attaching files and links to an email as you're going through them. So if you use things like predictive text or Gmail as well, hitting tab whenever you're writing a sentence to complete the sentence for you is something Microsoft are doing. So it's in public preview at the moment, and a really good example I had with a customer the other week was when they were typing out an email, they didn't specifically have to attach files in there because it goes across the entire Microsoft 365 ecosystem. The artificial intelligence built into Context IQ can associate documents. So, for example, if I was writing an email to the Camwood organisation, I said, "Hey, can everyone take a look at James Churchill's latest document?" Instead of having to hard attach the document into the email itself, it actually shares the file through a link, and it just makes the productivity of that particular email much quicker. And probably one of the more important features that I find very, very useful is if I'm trying to organise a meeting, and there's lots of people in the email thread, I may say something along the lines of, "Hi guys, I want to organise a meeting for this Friday." As soon as I finish that sentence, it will pop open a little drop down to give me the next available time for absolutely everyone on that thread. So it just makes emails and calendars sort of sync and integration much easier. At the same time, you can link things like Dynamics 365 sales data into Microsoft Teams. So it's really around sort of extending the scope of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem and just making everything a lot more productive as well as you go through. Mesh for Microsoft Teams. I've got a specific section around this because it is a very interesting topic, but sort of in short and in summary, there was a lot of chatter about the metaverse, certainly from companies like Microsoft and Facebook, which is now called Meta, and AWS and the like. And ultimately, Microsoft are wrapping that technology into Microsoft Teams, and they're calling it Mesh. And I'll go through that in a bit more detail a little bit later. Microsoft Viva Learning, that module has now gone fully GA, which is really exciting. So for those of you who don't know, Viva is a digital experience employee solution software that Microsoft have released. And it's all really around sort of the well-being and ensuring you're getting the most out of your team and your staffing, etc. And again, I've got a section around that in a bit more depth a little bit later. Microsoft Cloud for sustainability. So I mentioned this in our Inspire recap at the latter part of last year, but again, it's really good to see Microsoft are putting their foot down on the sustainability model that they're pushing forwards, and it's really good to see that Microsoft are helping not only organizations to understand what their footprint is and ultimately what they can do to reduce it, but Microsoft coming up with sustainability programs for their data center projects and everything associated to it, because as a very large corporation, they have a very big responsibility to ensure that they're reducing the amount of carbon footprint they're outputting, and they've got lots of projects going on for that as well. And then finally, Microsoft Defender for Business. So for any SMB organizations on the call today, this is really exciting. So if you're utilizing the Microsoft 365 for Business standard or premium licensing SKUs for your productivity models within Microsoft 365, Microsoft will be releasing, or have released, a Defender SKU associated to your licensing as well. So typically this is something that was only really available for enterprise customers or as an additional add-on or bolt-on. And it's good to see Microsoft are releasing Microsoft Defender, which is everything that you can expect from anomaly detection, threat detection, AV, signature database threat protection, and everything associated to a next-gen antivirus. So it's really good to see that Microsoft have included their SMB customers in Ignite this year. Okay, so on to modern management. It wouldn't be a talk for Camwood if we didn't talk about modern management. And I'm going to sort of introduce it with what Satya said at Ignite itself. So hybrid work represents the biggest shift to how we work in our generation, and I think he's reasonably spot on in terms of the hybrid working model. I think it's important to note that although through the pandemic and even now as we start to come out the back of it, hybrid working is there to stay. We as individuals and people have never been more connected than ever, but we're more physically dispersed than ever before. So it's ensuring that Microsoft are really putting a focus on the modern management solutions they have in their stack, and ultimately ensuring that customers have got absolutely everything they need, and partners have got absolutely everything they need to help improve the hybrid working model as a whole. So going from left to right, we talked about Microsoft Defender for Business. Really good to see that included, but like I was saying before, it's not a cheap knockoff of what Microsoft Defender is. It's a fully fledged business enterprise tooling set, just included in the lower SKU model now. So everything you can think of in terms of next generation or antivirus protection, automated investigation, remediation, and threat vulnerability management, really important for a lot of SMBs out there, because cybersecurity is pretty much at the forefront of what everyone's talking about, certainly from a hybrid working model. Defender for Cloud Apps is quite an interesting model as well. So it was formerly Microsoft Cloud App Security. So the marketing team do a fantastic job of rebranding every sort of 6 to 12 months. So it's good to try and keep on top of things. But it's really around how you protect your Microsoft 365 apps in the cloud as a whole. So things like application governance capabilities, have you got the right grounding of footprint and compliance policy sets that are going to help you deliver your applications to your end users. The security and policy management, as I said, cybersecurity is at the forefront of everything we're doing. We need to ensure that Microsoft are giving you absolutely everything you need to deliver. And sort of more interestingly, being able to leverage some of the more next generational technologies like machine learning, graph API, and data analytics service available to it as well. Finally, Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So everyone knows it as a tool set associated to Config Manager if you're in a co-management perspective, or in Microsoft Intune. They continue to develop and invest in the technology to ensure that they're covering as much as the ecosystem as possible. So Linux desktop management, something that was pretty much unheard of 6 to 12 months ago. So it's really good to see that Microsoft cover the ecosystem across the board. Improvements around the Mac operating system device management model as well. So it's always been a bit of a contentious point. If an organization have Macs in the device, do they need something like Jamp to manage them instead of Intune and Endpoint Manager? I think it's fair to say that Mac OS management in Endpoint Manager and Intune is much better than it was sort of 12 to 18 months ago. And I would challenge most organizations to say you need to look at Intune whenever you're talking about Mac operating system models. Microsoft Connected Cache. So this is really important for organizations that use config manager and distribution points. So it's a piece of technology that sits on top of your existing distribution points, and it allows you to make full use of something called delivery optimization, which is typically only really exclusively available for Endpoint Manager and Intune management. But it's really around how organizations can improve the bandwidth being sucked through their network whenever they talk about downloading applications, downloading Windows updates. Instead of pulling them all from a centralized point, delivery optimization allows the devices to share and peer cache the updates associated to it. So a really good example is you'll have 3 devices. Device 1 will pull down chunk 1 of the update, device 2 will pull down chunk 2, and device 3 will pull down chunk 3. And then from there, they will then start to share the missing chunks of that particular update amongst each other. So reduce the amount of bandwidth that's been sucked out of the networking as a whole. It just makes everything a lot more efficient from that perspective. And then Office and Windows update security baselines. So we were hoping they were going to come out around this sort of time. So typically Microsoft release a baseline policy in a very sort of similar manner to national cybersecurity benchmarks and CIS benchmarks as well. It really just gives organizations the best practice on what they need to do when they're securing their physical devices as well as their Office software as well. Back onto our theme of Microsoft security as a whole, these are sort of a little bit left field when we're talking about modern management, but there's a couple of bits in there that are quite interesting. Defender for IoT, again, previously Defender for IoT. It's had a little bit of a rebrand, but the core functionality is still there. So for organizations that work in black box environments, things that don't necessarily touch the internet, or if you have physical IoT devices, I'm thinking of point of sale systems, anything that's not a traditional operating system. This is where you can get full integration with your favorite SIEM tools, XDR tools, and ultimately the wider Defender ecosystem. And it's important to know Sentinel, Microsoft Azure Sentinel plugs directly into Defender for IoT. So it's really good to see that Microsoft is carrying on with this. Confidential computing. So this has been talked about for a while. Microsoft made a really early release model of what confidential computing looks like. And for those organizations out there that have a bigger view on privacy and sort of confidentiality whenever they're talking about the operating system model, especially within Microsoft Azure Cloud, it's always been a bit of a contentious point of, are my virtual machines actually secure? Are they confidential? Well, if you're utilizing the Gen 2 VMs with secure boot TPMs and then embedding the SGX technology as well as some of the AMD technology, you've got some of the best confidential computing out there, especially in a public cloud world. Defender for iOS and Android. So it was always a little bit of a wavy point when we were talking about protecting iOS and Android devices. So typically most organizations focus on their Windows or their Mac devices, so the physical laptop or desktop. Extending the Defender for smart devices and smartphones is really, really interesting to ensure that ultimately that you're covering your entire MDM and MAM platform across the board. So looking at things like jailbreak technology, OS vulnerabilities, but more importantly, it gives you a nice single pane of glass to manage, all your Windows and Mac operating system physical devices, as well as all your smart devices in a single pane of glass. And then finally, Defender for Cloud. So this is really, really interesting for organizations that are in a multi-cloud environment. I'm thinking sort of Microsoft Azure, AWS and GCP. The integration with Purview, which is the data compliancy solution that Microsoft have built, it allows you to ultimately gauge and assess your other cloud environments to ensure that you've got consistent standards across the board, and it provides security recommendations for those other environments. So if you have a benchmark and a baseline within Azure, and you're also in AWS and GCP, you have the ability to carry that baseline across into those other environments, regardless of what vendor or technology is associated to it. So it's good to see Microsoft collaborating with the other cloud vendors, which isn't always possible and doesn't always happen. So it's good to see that Microsoft are pushing forward to that and incorporating everything associated to it. Microsoft Teams and Mesh. So this is a very big topic. And it was probably the more front and center point of Ignite, and certainly has been talked about consistently over the last sort of 3 to 6 months from this point. So Microsoft Mesh is ultimately the metaverse, and the metaverse is a digital location or a digital experience in effect. So think of VR headsets, avatars like we've got on screen here. It's all around sort of bringing people closer together without actually physically having to do it. So the incorporation of the metaverse or mesh within Microsoft Teams is certainly the further evolution of how people are going to be collaborating together. Certainly over the last 2 years, I've lived on Microsoft Teams and Zoom meetings, and to a lesser extent some other vendors like Cisco WebEx, etc. And it can be quite difficult, especially if you have to turn your camera on. You've had a long day, you're bouncing from meeting to meeting to meeting, and sometimes you're just talking to someone and they haven't got their camera on, so you can't really gauge what's going on, what the responses are like to what you're saying. You're just staring at initials on the screen, which I think we can all sort of resonate with. What Mesh is, and the integration with Microsoft Teams, it allows you to build out a customizable avatar and allows you to explore digital workplaces and workspaces. So think about office spaces, think about conference center, conference rooms, and the ability to whiteboard solutions using your avatar, so you're moving around. So this is all the integration with VR. But if you haven't got VR and you for example, you don't want to turn your camera on, you can present your avatar to give the impression that you're you're engaging within the meeting, and ultimately you're providing someone with a context to sort of play back on. So it is currently an extended preview. We're expecting it to go full GA by the back end of this year. It's an interesting concept. Whether or not it will take on, I'm not sure, but I think this is the next sort of logical evolution of how we're doing sort of the virtual meeting spaces, etc. So sort of back to our original point of we've never been more connected than ever, but more physically dispersed. I think this is probably one of the things that the industry is going to be trying out and seeing if people adapt to it. Onto the employee digital experience. So we were talking about Viva. So if anyone that doesn't know what Viva is, ultimately it's an employee and a staffing well-being and productivity product that Microsoft brought out middle part of last year, I believe, or the early part of last year. And they're constantly adding to it and acquiring new visitors and adding their solution stacks into it. So there's 4 sort of main key modules. Viva Insights is really around sort of productivity and well-being. So have they got enough time to focus on a specific task? Have they got enough time to take a break, walk away from their device, do something else, meditate? It's all about sort of well-being associated to that. Topics connecting to knowledge and experts with either within your organization or with outside your organization if you have questions or if you want to bounce ideas off of, and it just becomes almost like a big message board. Viva Learning, which is something that we've just started incorporating within Camwood itself. So the integrations with third-party learning platform providers like Udemy, Pluralsight, and LinkedIn Learning, etc., and being able to assign that and integrate that into Microsoft Teams to say, okay, guys, we all need to watch this video or follow through with this learning. Here's the task associated to it, and you can assign each person a task to ensure that they complete it. But it's really, again, just bringing everything into a single pane of glass and ultimately ensuring that ultimately we're getting everything into it as well. And then Microsoft Viva Connections. So in a very sort of similar fashion to collaboration and communicating with each other, making sure we're engaged and formed into everything that we're doing. So the other interesting point is Microsoft have just acquired Ali.io. And for anyone that doesn't know who Ali are, they are an OKR company. So it'll be interesting to see how Microsoft start wrapping OKRs into Microsoft Viva in the future as well. And then finally, Windows 11. Again, we can't talk about Microsoft product sets certainly without talking about Windows 11. So Windows 11 has had sort of more continuous updates through Ignite. We've seen some more since then as well. I think it's imperative and important to note that even though it's gone fully GA and you can start adopting it now, a lot of organizations, and certainly we're advising our customers to wait until the middle part or certainly the latter part of this year for Microsoft to get their first release out of the way. That'll fix a lot of the major bug and feature issues that were released on launch. But that being said, it's going to be a future-proof model in terms of that this is what your operating system is going to look like in the short to medium term in the future as well. So most organizations are going to be waiting to the autumn before they start trialing it, certainly to get that first release out of the way. But more importantly, it's good to see that Microsoft are supporting a lot of customers in this now, and they're bringing out the tool sets and the development of the solutions to support it end to end. So Windows Update for Business Deployment Service is incorporated into Windows 11 to ultimately streamline how you're updating your Windows 10 devices into Windows 11. So they're trying to remove as much friction as possible. Microsoft TestBase for 365. So for those of you who don't know, TestBase is a way to test your applications up against a particular operating system model. It's only just come out of GA, and it's more focused around sort of software providers. So think of Microsoft Outlook and other software providers out there. Effectively, you have to write your own scripts, and it takes about 48 hours to get test results back. So Microsoft have started going down a particular route. It'll be interesting to see if actually people start adopting it versus products like Remo 3 and Infinity Evergreen that we're heavily involved with, which is on-demand testing of your applications up against a particular operating system model to ensure that they work for every monthly patch or ultimately a feature update like Windows 11 here. Universal Print support. So Universal Print, for those of you who don't know, is a centralized cloud management platform for all your printing needs. So typically most organizations have a print server on-prem or maybe in the cloud, and they share their printers out and their printing queues out to all their devices using group policies or some form of process set that way. Universal Print simplifies that and streamlines it and brings it all into one cloud management platform to ultimately make it a lot easier to distribute everything through Intune and Endpoint Manager as well. Windows 365, glad to say that Windows 11 support is there. We were all expecting it. Really good solution if no one's actually started trialing the Windows 365 solution. It's really strong, and we're seeing a really nice uptick from a customer base from this now. People start adopting it in comparison to AVD. Windows 11 support for Azure Virtual Desktop was always going to come in sort of a similar fashion, so it's good to see that that's there now, and we've started getting customers to start trialing it. So it's a good solution, but we would suggest keep it in line with the rest of your desktop estate if you are using VDI like Azure Virtual Desktop, just to ensure that you're keeping consistency across the board to simplify everything. And then finally, Microsoft Azure Stack HCI, so the rapid high performance computing, Windows 11 support there as well. So really good to see that Windows 11 is moving along quite nicely. But like I said, we're looking at sort of the back end of this year to ensure we're getting the most out of the release set from that point of view. So finally, just before I hand over to James again, from a summarized perspective, it was a really good conference this year. The videos are still up there if you want to go through and pick out a few particular technology solution stacks that you want to run through. For those of you who will get the opportunity in the future, I do suggest that you go in physically attend it once the conference centres are open again. because it's a different kind of world and it's a different kind of experience all in. But the hybrid working model and the metaverse will probably the front and center stage. The metaverse and mesh for teams is going to be an interesting development over the next 6 to 12 months, and it'll be interesting to see what they release very soon after. And ultimately, from a hybrid working perspective, it's interesting to see how Microsoft are adopting their technology and accelerating everything they've got from a hybrid working model perspective. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for attending. Hopefully that was useful, and I'll hand you back to James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. That was definitely very interesting to hear. So I've got a couple of questions actually that have popped up that I'll just fire over to you if that's okay. So there's a few here, just thinking about what you're saying there in the summary. You were touching then about hybrid working. So one of the questions is, if we look at the pandemic and if we take a view that the pandemic is perhaps slowing down, do you feel that hybrid working will actually slow down and to the point it may stop as well as a result? I mean, everything you've talked about here is with a view of hybrid working continuing. So what's your take on that?
It's difficult to say at the minute. I would say sort of broadly, I don't think hybrid working is ever going to go away again. I mean, Camwood as an organisation, we do hybrid working and we'll never change from that. We found out through the pandemic it worked really well. With a lot of other organisations as well. I think there will be some sectors that just have to go back in, but I think the flexibility is now there, certainly from a support perspective and a productivity perspective. I don't think hybrid working will ever disappear now. I think flexible working will just become the norm, and that's something we're starting to see as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then thinking about the technology you've talked about, but also, if organisations are maintaining hybrid working, do you see any big security, cyber security threats over the next 12 to 18 months?
So it's difficult to say what's going to come out in the next 12 to 18 months, but ultimately footprint protection is probably the biggest key. So we've got a lot of organisations that protect their estate using things like Microsoft Intune and Windows Defender, etc., and that's good. But you need to incorporate things like conditional access, multi-factor authentication to ensure that sort of number one, you're protecting your users, you're protecting your data, and sort of more importantly, you're protecting your infrastructure. So if you haven't got that remote monitoring and the remote security models that you need in place, I think those are probably your biggest risk factors. The other one to consider is unsecure internet connections at remote locations. So most people work out of the home, which is fine, but then you'll have shared Wi-Fi connections if someone's in a coffee shop or in a shared workspace. You need to think about how you can protect the endpoints from unsecure internet connections as well. So there's not enough time to talk about cybersecurity within the models we've got at the moment. But as long as you're following the vendor best practice, certainly from a Microsoft standpoint, the security landscape should be more than acceptable.
Understood. Okay. And then just a final question to finish on, and you did touch on this when you were talking about Windows 11 and your personal advice and on behalf of Camwood of when to start thinking about adopting it. But from a wider general use across organisations, when do you think organisations will start adopting Windows 11 and moving to it?
Yeah, I started talking that a little bit on the last slide around Windows 11. I mean, we would recommend holding off until probably October, November, because we are expecting release a feature update release in the middle of this year, so probably in the summer. We've had customers start adopting it, or certainly start trialing it and then dropping it straight away because there's still a lot of feature updates and bugs available within the current model set. There's also a lot of work you need to do around your application estate. So Microsoft do a fantastic job to do some upfront work around, these apps will work on Windows 11 if they've worked on Windows 10, and that's true, but Microsoft are testing it on a vanilla operating system model. They're not testing it on customer-specific operating system models. So, ensuring that you've done all your testing on your particular operating system and ensuring that you've had all your configurations integrated into it will give you the clearest model. So I really realistically think it will be the latter part of this year, early part of next year, when customers really start to adopt it in earnest.
Makes perfect sense. Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Well, those were great questions. Many thanks, everyone. And as Dan said, many thanks for attending today. Hope you found the time beneficial. Hope you have a great day. You can see Dan's details there at the bottom should you ever wish to contact him directly. But likewise, if you need to speak to anyone that would speak to your relevant account manager, etc. So without that, enjoy your day. Have a lovely time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Many thanks.
Thanks, everyone.